The gifts of the Spirit, their real importance. The gifts of the Spirit are a normal part of church life, and they always have been. Everywhere that there have been genuine Christian fellowships of believers, the gifts of the Spirit have been present. Ever since the time of the Book of Acts, Christian fellowships spread throughout the world. Every nation has its own story. I've done videos on how the gospel arrived in the British Isles long before the arrival of the Roman Catholic Church. In Europe, such groups as the Pickards and the Waldenses, also known as the Waldensians, kept the flame alive. Whenever there was a gathering of simple believers worshipping God, the gifts of the Spirit started to manifest. In the New Testament, they are described primarily in 1 Corinthians 12, 13 and 14, Romans 12 and Ephesians 4. The purpose of this video is not to list them all, but simply to explain their importance. An example of the gifts of the Spirit in a previous century would be the Labadists, a 17th century Protestant religious community movement founded by Jean de Labadie, a French preacher and teacher. Jean de Labadie felt he had been called by God to re-establish apostolic churches. He believed each church fellowship should be independent and did not agree with church synods controlling independent congregations. Wherever he went, people were enthralled by his preaching, but he also met with massive opposition from established churches. At one point, he established a community in a place called Herford in Saxony, Germany. The community decided to introduce community of goods as a way of expressing their giving up of worldly things. When this change was announced, they were engaged in communion in memory of the Lord's death. At this point, a spiritual ecstasy came over all of them. They began to speak in tongues and dance. This went on for about an hour. This is not an unusual occurrence. Similar stories could be told of such groups as the Moravians, the Camisards, who were French Huguenots, and the early Quakers. Wherever true fellowships of believers were established, they were accompanied by visions, prophecies, and speaking in tongues. And we can see this going back, obviously, to the time of Acts, but since then, Irenaeus records it in the 2nd century, and as I've said, ever since then, these gifts have manifested themselves. I am making this point to show that the gifts of the Spirit have always been present where there are groups of Christian believers. Some people think that they died out after the time of the Book of Acts and came back with a Pentecostal revival in the 20th century. Others, known as cessationists, believe that these gifts have ceased completely since the time of Acts. My point is that the gifts have never gone away. Now, there are many preachers who are quite sound in many ways, but they still believe in cessationism. An example would be John MacArthur, the well-known preacher and teacher. He is a cessationist, and he holds that the sign gifts, such as prophecy and speaking in tongues described in the Bible, were temporarily granted to the apostles to authenticate the origin and truth of the scriptures, and that at the close of the apostolic age, these gifts had served their purpose and ceased to be granted. As I've said, my point is actually that the gifts have continued since the time of the apostles, and they've never gone away. The real significance of the gifts can be found in Mark 16. First, a word of warning about modern Bible translations. If you have a modern Bible translation, you will probably find a note saying something like, The earliest manuscripts and some other ancient witnesses do not have verses 9 to 20. The earliest manuscripts they're talking about are usually the Codex Vaticanus, the Codex Sinaiticus, and the various Alexandrian texts. All these texts are actually corrupted. I have done a series of videos on Bible texts if you want more information. Actually, the whole of Mark 16 is Holy Scripture, including verses 9 to 20. The relevant verses for us here are Mark chapter 16, verses 17 to 18 in the King James Version. And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents. And if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover. These are the signs that follow believers in Jesus Christ. Speaking in tongues and healing are both listed in the Bible as gifts of the Spirit. The point is that the gifts follow believers. We should not therefore have a take it or leave it attitude towards them. Some people argue that it is the fruit of the Spirit that is important because this is what God measures us by. This is true, but the important thing to remember is that the gifts of the Spirit should be present where believers are gathered. If they are not present, something is wrong. Historically, wherever groups of believers have manifested the spiritual gifts, they have received opposition from established institutional churches. This is because when a group of believers is led by the Spirit, they are not under human control. A church fellowship should operate under the authority of the elders, but the elders must not quench the Spirit. The gifts are freely given by God as He chooses. They are also a sign given by God to demonstrate His power and His reality. Thank you for listening. If you found this video interesting, you can find more information at prophecy-workshop.com.